Shutdown in Moscow. Will the US stand up to Putin? Vitkoff's secret visit may decide the fate of the entire peace plan. Europe sounds the alarm. Kallas warns this could be a decisive week for Ukraine. Diplomacy is reaching a breaking point. Kyiv moved forward despite scandals. New high-stakes talks begin. And now the big question: will Washington resist Putin's pressure or fall into another Kremlin trap? The US should think very carefully about what this really means, because Putin is already rewriting reality. Welcome to Ukraine Today. I'm Zaroslava Kolesnikova, and what happens next could change the course of the war. Shutdown in Moscow. Will the US resist Putin? Vitkoff's secret visit could decide the future of the peace plan. A high-risk mission is now unfolding, and the future of the US peace plan for Ukraine may be decided not in Washington or Kyiv, but inside the Kremlin. According to The Times, US Special Envoy Steve Vitkoff and Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner are flying to Moscow for a private meeting with Vladimir Putin. Western partners fear one thing: will the Americans hold the line, or will Putin bend to peace plan to his advantage? This visit comes during a moment of extreme political weakness in Kyiv and growing doubts about Vitkoff's neutrality. Kremlin already exploits the scandal in Kyiv. The trip is overshadowed by the shock resignation of Ukrainian's presidential chief of staff Andriy Yermak, who stepped down after an anti-corruption raid. Putin instantly weaponized the scandal, again calling Ukrainian leaders corrupt Nazis and accusing President Zelensky of thieving leadership. Trump also commented,
"The corruption situation does not help. Ukraine has some difficult problems."
In Kyiv, these words sent alarm bells ringing. Official fears Putin will use the scandal to push Vitkoff and Kushner toward concessions during their closed-door Kremlin talks. Is Vitkoff already too close to Moscow? Doubts about Vitkoff exploded last week when Bloomberg published a leaked transcript of his call with Kremlin advisor Yuri Ushakov. In it, the US envoy appears to give strategic advice to Moscow.
"I told the president that Russia always wanted a peace deal. That is my opinion."
He also suggested the Kremlin should call the White House before Zelensky to shape Trump's thinking. On November 13, a surreal diplomatic meeting took place not in Brussels, not in Geneva, but in Vitkoff's Miami Golf Club. There, US officials Vitkoff, Kushner and Secretary of State Marco Rubio met Ukrainian's Rustem Umerov, who was only added to the delegation after Yermak's sudden resignation. That meeting shaped the next steps of the peace plan and made the Moscow trip unavoidable. Who will win the psychological battle, Washington or the Kremlin? Will the United States stand firm, or will Putin use this secret meeting to twist the peace plan in Russia's favor? Kaja Kallas: this could be a decisive week for Ukraine. EU warns diplomacy reaches a critical point. The coming days may become a turning point for Ukraine's path to long-term peace, as a series of high-stakes negotiations unfolds across Europe and the United States. This prediction was made by EU High Representative of Foreign Affairs and Secretary Policy Kaja Kallas, writes Le Figaro.
This may be a decisive week for diplomacy. We heard yesterday that the talks in America were difficult but productive.
According to her, the final outcome of the Miami negotiations between the Ukrainian and US delegations is still unknown. However, Kaja Kallas will hold discussion with Ukrainian's defense minister and foreign minister to clarify the situation. Earlier, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky emphasized that starting Monday, Ukraine enters a highly important period.
This week there will be a lot of work with our partners in Europe, and it is important that we all share the same view. Pressure on Russia, the only cause of this war, can truly work for peace, not pressure on Ukraine.
Zelensky stressed that unity among allies is essential as conversation intensify around the developing US peace plan and Europe's own security concerns. Will Washington, Brussels and Kyiv engaged in fast-moving negotiations? Diplomats say the next few days may shape the entire architecture of future peace talks. Scandals won't stop Kyiv. New high-stakes negotiations ahead. Kyiv isn't slowing down. Despite political news of fresh scandals, Ukraine is preparing for a new round of crucial negotiations next week, talks that may shape the next phase of the war and the peace process. The groundwork is already been laid. What will Kyiv demand? How will partners respond? And could these talks shift the global balance?
Scandals are no obstacle to negotiations. Kyiv is preparing for the next rounds.
There will be important negotiations next week, not only for our delegation but for me as well. And we are laying a solid foundation for such negotiations. Ukraine will stand strong on its feet. It will always stand. Thank you to everyone who helps us.
The preparations for further negotiations were marked by yet another extraordinary event. Anti-corruption agencies conducted searches at the home of Andriy Yermak, the head of the Ukrainian negotiation team.
Today, NABU and SAP are indeed carrying out procedural actions at my home. The investigators are facing no obstacles. They were given full access to the apartment with my lawyers present who are cooperating with law enforcement. I am providing full cooperation from my side.
As a result of the searches, no charges have been brought. But already on Thursday evening, Yermak resigned. Meanwhile, the Kremlin received a revised peace plan from the US and Ukraine during the negotiations in Geneva.
The US handed over to Russia the parameters of the plan agreed with Kyiv in Geneva. Discussion of the document is scheduled for next week.
It is now absolutely clear to everyone, especially after the leak of those recordings of Dmitriev and Ushakov's conversations. The leaks about the so-called United States plan, the peace plan, show that it was a special operation by the Kremlin.
After the previous 28-point US plan was leaked to the press, causing a serious stir and a wave of criticism, the White House classified the latest version of the peace plan. And now even European diplomats do not know what is in the document.
This is an unprecedented situation from a diplomatic point of view. None of us have this information.
Meanwhile, Viktor Orban, Putin's Trojan horse in Europe, arrived in Moscow for a visit. At a meeting with the Hungarian Prime Minister, Putin tried to revive the idea of negotiations with Trump in Budapest.
That was Donald's proposal. And where did it come in then? He immediately said, "We have good relations with Hungary, you have good relations with Viktor, and so do I. So I'm suggesting this option. Of course, we would be happy to agree. And if, during our ongoing negotiations, it truly comes to using the Budapest platform, I would also be very pleased."
So, in fact, Orban's visit, the Hungarian Prime Minister, is precisely about Moscow setting up the next trap. And all of this is happening in parallel with the supposed consideration of the United States peace plan already revised in Geneva. No, we need to be very clear that they are not interested in this revised plan at all.
Moscow's goal is to pull the wool over Trump's eyes. Lies, manipulation, distortion of concepts, and simulated activity. Putin and his gang are doing everything possible to avoid taking real steps toward ending the war. But at the same time, not to spoil relations with Washington.
Now, we can already see that at this stage, Pest has once again started to appear on the agenda, and of course, without Kyiv and without Brussels as a potential meeting place for Trump and Putin. And of course, Putin, or rather, will be pushing Trump toward a kind of second Alaska. Because, as they constantly put it, these 28 points were made taking into account the spirit of Anchorage. Now, the Russians will undoubtedly try to implement this significant spirit of Anchorage in a potential and upcoming meeting, perhaps in the near future.
The best evidence of the aggressors' absolutely non-peaceful intentions is the battlefield, where the occupiers are only increasing their activity and the intensity of their assault operations, continuing their offensive in Donbas and the Zaporizhzhia direction.
The United States should think carefully about what this really means and what Russia is preparing for. Putin is trying to rewrite reality again. The Kremlin has issued a new directive. Officials must convince foreign partners that Russia is a democracy rooted in the rule of law. At the same time, the war continues, repression grows, and freedoms shrink. All the details ahead.
Putin has decided to stir things up again.
I ask you not to slow down the pace of accomplishing the assigned tasks.
Now, by order of the Kremlin's master, officials must convince foreigners that Russia is, above all, about democracy and the rule of law.
Just today, Volodin started telling everyone, he's the Speaker of the State Duma, started telling everyone that apparently foreigners are fleeing to Russia from this damned Europe. Why do you think? For freedom of speech.
To thus shape an objective opinion abroad of Russia as a state governed by the rule of law, this is part of the Kremlin's strategy until 2036.
Let's suppose for a moment that one day the war will finally end or at least pause. That doesn't mean the Kremlin will just stash away its main desires somewhere in a closet. Nothing of the sort. As long as Putin is in power, his main ambitions remain in place and aren't going anywhere. And what is his main ambition? His main ambition isn't even Ukraine. Putin's biggest ambition today is to redefine the world so that he can bring all the countries of the former Eastern Bloc back under his influence.
But still, who is this really aimed at? At the Russians themselves to boost their patriotic spirit, or at an external audience?
Officials don't have to explain all this to the Russian electorate. The Russian voter understands perfectly well that none of this is real. But it's the Western people who need all this explained to them. How wonderful things are in Russia, how great everything is here, and how bad things are in the West. In the West, everything is terrible. There's no freedom of speech. There's nothing at all. They're all being deceived, those poor souls, and even deprived of cheap Russian oil and gas because everyone is just so awful.
So, in words, it's a paradise. Equal rights, freedom, traditional values, but in reality it's repression, restrictions, and criminal liability for your opinions.
That's what doesn't exist, right? So what freedoms are there in Russia today? None. Yes, literally none at all. You can't speak, you can't gather. And there are no elections either. So there are no civil liberties at all. So what could you possibly tell a Westerner about how great life is in Russia? I'm not even talking about purely economic issues. Just today, for example, we read that the Russian government has started up the printing press because the budget deficit is simply enormous.
But here's the catch. Besides fairy tales about the right Russia, the Kremlin also wants to step up the promotion of Russian culture and traditional values abroad. In other words, it's not enough for them to influence other countries. They want even more.
I would say that, unfortunately, Putin is quite effective in this propaganda strategy of his. And then, when Trump came to power in the United States, a man who seems to think all this is nonsense and who might even genuinely believe that Putin stands for traditional values, though what traditional values are we talking about if Putin himself doesn't even have a family? Seriously, what traditional values are there, honestly?
And what's funny is that Putin presents all of this as some kind of fight against Russophobia. The document is also intended to help preserve the unity of the people and the territorial integrity of the country.
How is Putin's propaganda different from Soviet propaganda? The difference is that Putin pours huge amounts of money into propaganda on the one hand, and on the other they operate in a technologically savvy way. In other words, they take and use all modern methods.
A heavy burden has fallen on the shoulders of Russian officials. But why them specifically? Doesn't Russia have other, more reliable and familiar ways of exerting influence?
For officials, it's more of a scare tactic. Because, as we know, officials are quite fond of vacationing in Europe. And so, when this is stated directly to them, it's also a warning. Don't even think about going anywhere without approval. It should be noted that nowadays, in Russia, you really can't go anywhere without approval because, almost like in Soviet times, foreign passports are being confiscated.
Russia is trying to build a beautiful facade, one that it has destroyed itself. But the world isn't blind either. And in the Kremlin's case, actions are completely at odds with the pretty words.
That's all for today on Ukraine Today. If you believe the truth should be louder than Kremlin lies, like, share and subscribe. Your support keeps us on the information front line. Stay strong, stay informed and stand with Ukraine.